Well, good morning again and welcome to Kingsway Christian Church. So for those of you who have met my husband, you know that he is a bit of a storyteller, which is a good thing since he's also a minister. But for those of you who know me, I often want to get straight to the point. Despite these differences, we both agree that the stories that we tell are important. So I'm going to tell you a story about my husband this morning, which I do have his permission to share. I'm not just teasing him this morning. A few years ago, we were with the family of the senior pastor that I worked with. And we were on a school bus going to the local town festival. The fairgrounds didn't have a lot of parking, so you had to park somewhere and hop a school bus to get there. So we were sitting in the back of the bus being cool with the two older kids who were at that point about 8 and 5 years old. And as we were on our way, of course, we're chatting with the kids, and the older kid said, "I don't understand why we don't have to wear seatbelts on a bus. Like, we wear them in a car, and like sometimes buses have a couple of rows of seatbelts, but like why don't buses have seatbelts on every seat?" Now, if I would have been the first to answer the question, it would have been age appropriate, clear, and to the point. However, my husband started in first. So he said, "Well, you know, from the looks of it, this school bus is pretty old. It was probably a school bus back when Sandra and I were your age. And well, back then," he actually paused for dramatic effect, "back then, you see, there were just a lot of children, like an excessive amount of children." And I instantly cut him off because I knew what he was about to say. And I also knew that these children really looked up to my husband and hung on his every word. They were in a very literal phase of their lives and took Sam very seriously. The last thing I needed was my boss's kids to think that school buses were intentional murder machines for children their age. A few months later, I surprised my husband Sam for his birthday to go to the opening of Legoland in Boston. And I had to borrow my boss's kids again to go with us because, understandably, Legoland is not okay with random adults showing up without children. So the four of us were on our way and drove past some wind turbines. And the younger kid this time asked, "How do wind turbines work?" Sam started in before I could answer. Always the storyteller. And this one, he started to describe an elaborate story about how there are hundreds of treadmills hooked up in the basement of wind turbines, and that people run on the treadmills to spin the blades, and that these people are motivated by MC Hammer doing his Can't Touch This dance. To this day, those kids remember the wind turbine story, despite the fact that they have no idea who MC Hammer is. But thankfully, they don't remember the bus story. The stories we tell become the stories we believe. Which brings us to today's scripture, a lesser-known story in between two much more well-known, much more well-talked-about stories in the Torah, the first 5 books of Hebrew scripture. Prior to the passage we read today is the conclusion of Genesis, with Joseph saving the Egyptians from years of famine. Joseph, as an outsider, a Hebrew person, comes into Egypt to rise from prisoner to the king's number 2. From there, we enter into the book of Exodus, the book that tells us the story of the Hebrew people's journey from slavery to freedom. The first few verses of Exodus that we skipped over today name that Joseph and his brothers have all died, and that the Hebrew people have been exceedingly fruitful and multiplied in Egypt. What will come after the section we heard today is a much more well-known story, the story of the birth of Moses and his journey from the Nile River to Mount Sinai. But here, book-ended between two epic tales, is a tale just as epic that often goes untold, the story of the midwives of the Hebrew people. Our reading today begins by naming that the story of Joseph had been forgotten by Pharaoh. The stories we tell become the stories we believe. The new ruler did not know why all these Hebrew people were in his land, and he certainly wasn't a fan of how many of them there seemed to be. And he did what rulers often do to minority groups. He found ways to oppress the people. He sought to enslave them to ensure that they would not revolt against his rule. It is often painful at how relatable ancient stories are. But Pharaoh's plan didn't work. Despite grueling conditions, the Hebrew people continued to survive and multiply. So he did what most rulers should do. He called in the women. He called in the midwives. Now, a deep dive into this text reveals that we don't know if the women called to Pharaoh's court were Hebrew or Egyptian, just that they were the midwives to the Hebrew people. They might not have even had the same identity as the women they served, but they served them nonetheless. Women are pretty awesome. Interestingly, the midwives in this story are named. So few women are named in the holy texts of many religions. And then keep in mind that these stories were told for generations before they even became ancient texts. Clearly, a story the ancestors marked important to tell. Pharaoh instructs these women to kill all male children born to Hebrew people. In the original language of Scripture, there really isn't a word that means religion. The closest we get to the idea of religion is often translated, as it was today, as the word fear. Fear is a bit off from its original intent. This concept can be more fully translated to mean in complete awe, to be in complete awe of God. These were faithful women. Now, when the king questions the midwives as to why they have not done what they commanded, when you read different translations, it usually makes me giggle, because they basically say, like, well, shucks, king, sorry, didn't get there in time. And there are countless interpretations of these words spoken by these powerful women. Unsurprisingly, a lot of historical Christian writers, men, have focused throughout centuries on if these women were lying and what kind of sin that was, and reconciling what the scholars believe should have been the punishment for these midwives, while being confused that the statement comes right after that these women were favored and blessed by God. Other interpretations, including those in the Jewish tradition, wonder a bit more deeply and a bit less legalistically. One suggestion is that the midwives intentionally dilly-dallied on their way to the birth of the Hebrew women, so that they literally didn't get there in time, making it so they weren't technically lying to Pharaoh, but still following God's will. Another idea is that the midwives were actually playing into what was likely Pharaoh's feelings and stereotypes towards the Hebrew people, that these women were more like cattle, closer to animals than people, that these hardy women didn't need assistance during birth. This attitude has been painfully repeated by those with power throughout human history. Somehow we keep forgetting that people are people. The stories we tell of other people become the stories we believe about other people. Now, I don't know about you, but have you ever hung around midwives or whose role it is to be a part of the birth process? These people are tough. When I served as a student hospital chaplain, I had the antepartum, postpartum, and NICU wing. There is no community quite like the birthing community. In ancient times, it would have been a select group of women who were knowledgeable about the bodies in ways that us modern readers would minimize. But if the Hebrew people were multiplying, clearly the midwives were doing something right. This female-only space of midwives, I believed, was a community at its best. One that is so real, vulnerable, where you're literally letting it all hang out, that there is a tangible divine mutuality. Based on what I know about groups of women at their best, I believe that the midwives' stories to Pharaoh were an intentional act of civil disobedience, not playing by the rules of the powerful, but by behaving by the rules of the beloved. I assume that these skillful women were righteously lying to protect women they loved. They were protecting women who had just experienced the trauma of giving birth, a trauma we super don't talk about in the public sphere, but is definitely talked about in female spaces. The midwives were preventing other women from experiencing a trauma that is all too familiar to many of us on this call, losing a child. These women who changed the course of history by their defiance. And while their names live buried in pages between two men, they are the ones who literally birthed the Hebrew people, the people for whom both Judaism and Christianity trace their heritage. Shiprah, meaning beautiful, and Puah, meaning to cry out, beautifully cry out for those who were being persecuted and follow that cry with tangible action. This is a story we need to tell so that it becomes a story we believe. We need to be telling more stories of amazing women so that they become the stories we believe. There are countless women whose stories bear repeating today and every day. A woman who has helped me tell my own story is who we heard from earlier today, researcher and public speaker Brené Brown. Brené's more than decade of qualitative research began with the topic of shame. She was curious as to what made people more or less prone to experience this base, primitive emotion. She defines shame as the fear of disconnection, the fear of being unlovable. Shame is that voice in our head that tells us we're dumb, that tells us we're a terrible person, that tells us we're worthless. Shame is the voice in our head on repeat saying, I am not enough. And guess what? Everyone has a story with their relationship to shame. Shame is the emotion we often experience when we are in the same space of another story that bumps up against our own story. Shame is an epidemic that rips through the stories we tell. After listening to countless stories, Brown found a pattern in people less prone to shame. She calls these people wholehearted. Those that she saw as wholehearted had a sense of worthiness, a worthiness that did not come from the external world, rather a worthiness that is seen as a sense of love and belonging that is deeply a part of someone's being. People who are wholehearted, Brown poses, have a sense of courage, compassion, and connection. Sounds a lot like Shiprah and Puah to me. The wholehearted have a courage to tell their story, imperfections and all. And they first have compassion for themselves. This is vulnerability, Brown states. Vulnerability is the ability to let ourselves be fully seen and known, and to know that we are worthy of love and belonging. That's the story we need on repeat. Vulnerability is not only saying, but believing, I am worthy of love and belonging. Because if we can't start there, if we can't honestly say to ourselves, I am worthy of love and belonging, how in the world can we say that to others? Others who desperately need to not only hear that they are worthy of love and belonging, but to see tangible actions, to see new life being birthed in systemic change that embodies the truth of love and belonging. We've probably all told a lot of stories about ourselves in our own lives, not rooted in love and belonging. And we've told a lot of stories in this country that have not been rooted in love and belonging. And we are living in an era where we see the deadly manifestations of these stories every day. The stories we tell become the stories we believe. Stories shape our reality, from what we believe about people who are different than us to whether we believe MC Hammer is powering all of New England's wind turbines. So this morning, I invite you to reflect on the stories that surround you. What story do you tell yourself about yourself? Is it one rooted in shame or vulnerability? What story do you tell of your Christian faith? Where have you shared this story? And where have you stayed silent? What story do you tell about the state of our country and our world? Is it one rooted in fear or in God's everlasting hope? And finally, whose stories are you listening to? Whose stories are you not just listening to, but are you in relationship with? Are they stories that are comfortably similar to yours? Or are they ones that challenge you to not react, but to listen? Are they stories that require you to put on floaties and get into the deep end of the complexity of this thing called being a human? Or are they surface level and shallow? In order for us to tell stories that are not our own, we have to know the stories of others, because the stories we tell become the stories we believe. Why do you think we spend so much time reading stories to little kids? We're shaping their world. Somewhere along the way, often us grown-ups think we've outgrown stories in pursuit of fact and truth. But the thing is, this experiment called life is a beautiful, complicated, grand story, and is our responsibility to share in the fullness of that storytelling. We must be the authors of our own story and balance our story with the awareness that it is one in the piece of a great story. So as you leave this space today, set aside some time this week to both tell a story that is vulnerable and to listen to the story of a stranger, because it is our responsibility to not become like Pharaoh, to not forget or worse, ignore the stories of those around us. But it is our call to be like the midwives, like Shiprah and Puah, faithfully birthing new creation this day and every day. Amen.